Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We are now nearing the end of our third season, and we are just more excited than ever to continue to help you explore and understand that unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. Here we look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here are issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen in today for today's show on air quality and transportation. And today we're going to focus on why our transportation impacts climate change so much. Now, the U.S. transportation sector is responsible for about a third of our country's climate-damaging emissions. In California, transportation is the leading source of greenhouse gas pollution, accounting for about 40% of the state's emissions. And cars, though, aren't the only vehicles that pollute. You've got airplanes, ships, and trains, and they produce a large portion of the world's greenhouse gas emissions as well. Now, the Yale Climate Connections ask the question, how can American society reconcile people's seemingly boundless and endless love affair with their vehicles with the need to reduce carbon emissions? Well, mobility, getting around from place to place, clearly is essential to our economic growth. But in our carbon-based world, moving people from place to place does indeed extract a very steep price. For many people, the journey to and from work are the bookends of the daily grind. But how we choose to travel to the office or even to pop into shops is also one of the biggest day-to-day climate decisions we face, probably unknowingly. In countries like the United Kingdom and the U.S., the transport sector is now responsible for emitting more greenhouse gases than any other sector, including electricity production and agriculture. And then globally, transport accounts for around a quarter of the globe's CO2 or carbon emissions. And much of the world's transport networks still remain focused around the car. Road vehicles, that is cars, trucks, buses, and motorbikes, account for nearly 3/4, again, of the greenhouse gas emissions that come from transport. And collectively, cars and trucks account for nearly 1/5 of all U.S. emissions, emitting around 24 pounds of carbon dioxide and other global warming gases for every gallon of gas. About 5 pounds of these gases comes from the extraction, the production, and the delivery of the fuel, while the great bulk of the heat-trapping emissions, more than 19 pounds per gallon, come right out of a car's tailpipe. So the way you get around each day can make a big difference to your own carbon footprint. Many Americans love to drive and they love their cars, as we mentioned earlier, or at least the notion of car ownership. In 2018, there were 281.3 million vehicles registered to owners in the U.S. And Americans collectively drove more than 3 trillion miles in 2017. That was the most of any year since record keeping began, but I suspect it's higher now. So again, how can we collectively reconcile a need to reduce carbon pollution with people's, including mine, widespread fondness for driving, often with just one driver and no passengers, even in congested urban areas? The New York Times recently ran a short piece that suggested that people can make big changes in carbon emissions with fairly little effort simply by driving just 10% less, or about 1,350 fewer miles each year. And that that 1,350 fewer miles each year, that's the same as shutting down about 28 coal-fired power plants for a year. So along with daily driving, there is a steep cost to air travel, whether that's for work or play. Again, the New York Times wrote of the irony of people who are eager to visit places that are at risk of disappearing because of climate change, thereby hastening the demise of those places they love to fly to and visit. Cruise travel, meanwhile, poses its own threats to the globe's climate. The most efficient cruise ships emit 3 to 4 times more carbon emissions per passenger than commercial air travel. And people and goods are on the move faster and farther than ever before. And all that movement does come at a significant cost. And it's not just the sticker price of a new car, a train ticket, or a shipping bill, but also a big environmental cost. Then there's the opposite side of this coin. That is how climate change impacts our transportation systems and transportation structures. In the United States, transportation systems are designed to withstand local weather and climate. Transportation engineers typically refer to historical records of climate, especially extreme weather events, when they're designing transportation systems. For example, bridges are often designed to withstand storms that have a probability of occurring only once or twice every 100 years. Kind of like the 500-year floodplain. However, due to climate change, historical climate is no longer a reliable predictor of future risk. Climate change is projected to increase the frequency and the intensity of some extreme weather events. Specifically, heat waves will likely be more severe, as we here in Texas can attest to. Sea level rise could amplify storm surges in coastal areas, as my friends who I left behind in Miami can attest to, and precipitation will likely be more intense. And these changes could increase the risk of delays, disruptions, damage, and failure across our land-based, air, and marine transportation systems. Indeed, we're already seeing them. And most transportation infrastructure being built now is expected to last for 50 years or longer, maybe. Therefore, it's important to understand how future climate might affect these investments in the coming decades. Climate changes will likely impact roadways, ice roads, vehicles, and railways, and every other aspect of how we get from place to place. That is, it will impact them more, as we're already seeing some very significant impacts. Just this past week, we've been hearing daily on the news about the floods in Kentucky and how they're taking out some significant infrastructure there. And next week and week after, it'll probably be some different places, perhaps with some different extreme weather events. Now, this is a lot. But here today, to help us explore, understand, and unpack all of this some more, are two people who I'm very excited to have. We have with us today Kelly Blynn and Dr. Alberto Ayala. Kelly is Transportation and Climate Change Specialist at the Colorado Energy Office, where she works to accelerate transportation emissions reduction through policies, programs, and investments designed to increase the use of zero-emission vehicles, transit, and other sustainable travel modes. Previously, Kelly has worked as an advocate for public transportation, as a transportation electrification consultant to states and utilities, and as a technical assistance provider for cities who are working to accelerate EV adoption when she was at NRDC. Kelly holds a Master's of City Planning and a Master of Science in Transportation. Welcome, Kelly. Did I get all of that right?
You did. Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you for making time to join us. And then Alberto is Executive Director of the Sacramento Metropolitan Air Quality Management District. He's also an adjunct professor at West Virginia University, and he's a former Deputy Executive Officer of the California Air Resources Board. Alberto is a mechanical engineer with a BS, MS, and PhD degrees, as well as an author and co-author of more than 150 peer-reviewed publications and reports, including a contributing author to the book Ambient Combustion, Ultrafine Particles in Health, And he's the author of an upcoming book called The Three Forks in the Road, the Volkswagen Diesel Cheating Scandal, which is intriguing to me. Welcome, Alberto. And did I get all of that right?
You did. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. I'm glad that all of you all could join us. Now, we only have a little bit before we go to our first break. So I want to start with Kelly for a little bit. We're probably going to have to finish this up on the other side. But Kelly, before we really dig into this conversation, let's define what we mean about when we say transportation and transport before we go much further.
Sure. And I can help put it into context a little bit in terms of how some of the different segments of transportation contribute to emissions. So it does make sense that when you think transportation, you might think of the cars that we drive around every day, sedans, SUVs, pickup trucks. That sort of segment of the market nationally represents about 57% of our greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. The next tranche comes from our medium and heavy duty vehicles. So those are our trucks and buses, vehicles that pick up our trash and plow our snow in the winter if you're in a snowy place, haul our groceries, all those kinds of things. And that represents about 26% of our emissions from transportation nationally. 8% of our emissions come from aviation or flying, both passenger flights, but also other, sort of private or, cargo flights that occur as well. And then the remaining 2% of our emissions comes from sort of other, and that includes ships and boats, rail, motorcycles, pipelines. There's sort of a whole suite of other types of transportation, that we're not just talking about transporting people, but also goods as well that goes on in the sector. So hopefully that's a little bit of a helpful overview. Okay,
we'll continue that explanation, or you enlightening us on that after the break. So we'll be right back on the other side with Alberto Ayala and Kelly Blynn. Thank you all. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. Our other sponsor is Blynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, looking at the whole body, none mercury, specializing in periodontics. Dr. Blynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. And our other sponsor, our new sponsor, is the Weston A. Price Foundation, where ancestral wisdom meets modern science on food, farming, and the healing arts. The Weston A. Price Foundation is a nutrition foundation teaching people about healthy foods of the past and how you can incorporate them into your lives. The foundation educates people about why grass-fed and other foods are better quality and helps them find these foods. And with its 50% pledge campaign, the foundation encourages people to purchase 50% of their foods from local farms and artisans. Check them out at westernaprice.org. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on air quality and transportation, focusing in on why our transportation impacts climate change so much. And we are back with Alberto Ayala and Kelly Blynn, and they are just making us smart like them, we hope. And before the break, Kelly was kind of laying out the term transportation and helping us understand it's much more than just our cars. And you were telling us about, the different tranches of the trucks, the transport trucks. What about 18-wheelers, Kelly? Where do they fall in all of that?
Sure, yeah, that falls into our what we call medium and heavy duty vehicles, so our trucks and buses. And, those are the vehicles that transport our goods across country, which, I know many of us are increasingly relying on home deliveries and that sort of thing. So those are really the vehicles that are, helping run our economy and get goods to us. And so, yeah, we're, interested in figuring out how we can help make those vehicles cleaner over time and even run off of cleaner sources, cleaner fuels.
Indeed.
Like electricity and hydrogen. Then
there's ships and airplanes and spaceships.
Yes. Sure. I guess ultimately all of those are transportation. Anything that, can move either people or goods around, we refer to as transportation. I think many of us who work in the field do focus a lot on sort of the on-road transportation sector. So the cars that we drive, the trucks and buses that transport us and our goods, because that is where the bulk of emissions comes from, both from air pollution and greenhouse gases, but also are these other important areas like, ships and aviation and whatnot that are important to focus on as well.
But I think you did mention, and I want to summarize it, the cars or the on-road vehicles are well over 50% of the emissions.
Yeah, passenger vehicles or cars are about 57% nationally of our greenhouse gas emissions, and then our trucks and buses are about another 25%. So combined, that's a pretty big chunk of the issue that we're trying to tackle.
Indeed. Thank you, Kelly. I want to go to Alberto now. Can you describe for us, Alberto, the environmental impacts of the cars and the trucks and the planes and the other modes of transportation, and which is better or worse and why?
Oh, absolutely. I'd be happy to. The common thread between all of the different types of transportation modes that Kelly alluded to is the fact that by far nearly 100% of those vehicles or equipment are going to be relying on fossil fuels and mostly internal combustion engines that run on those fossil fuels. So when you talk about all the different sources of pollution, both air and climate pollution, the common theme between them is that the energy to move us in those vehicles is primarily the use of fossil fuel, and we burn those fossil fuels in internal combustions. And that is the source of both air pollution as well as greenhouse gas emissions. And in terms of which one is better versus the other, I mean, in the previous comments, you guys alluded to the different efficiencies of a ship versus a locomotive versus a truck. But probably the simplest thing to think about is over time, we have seen our transportation vehicles and equipment get more and more efficient, meaning they are generating lesser and lesser pollution per unit of fuel use. However, combustion is combustion, and that is the key for air quality and public health effects and the reduction of our carbon footprint is to the extent that we continue to rely on fossil fuel combustion to move us around, there is going to be a concern from an air quality standpoint, even in the event that on a per vehicle basis, these sources are getting much more efficient.
So on a per vehicle basis, they're getting more efficient, but everything I read tells me, too, we're getting more of them. So we're probably at about the same place. They're better per unit, but then it's more units.
And that's exactly the point. Just to add another statistic to what you've already shared. In the world, around the planet, we are fast approaching 2 billion cars, 2 billion with a B. So imagine, it's just a simple mathematics. How much emissions multiplied by 2 billion? That is a lot of air and climate pollution.
Indeed. And to put a fine point on it so people just can't escape the point, the issue is what powers those vehicles. It's the gas, fossil fuels, that's causing the problem. If all those vehicles ran on air, or maybe some electricity, then we could have 2 or 3 of them per person and without all of these issues. And all transportation has to run on some type of fuel. And that's why we're talking about this, and that's why it's such a great contributor to climate change and global warming, as I noted earlier, even more so than coal and electric power plants. that tend to get the boogaboo, but but again, that allows us not to focus in on our love affair with cars. So thank you for that. Now, Alberto, you were a contributor to a book, Ambient Combustion, Ultrafine Particles and Health. Tell us about this as well as other health impacts of our transportation system. And are there any stats on this in terms of those ultrafine particles? Because talking to people on the show, even other than and beyond transportation, I know that the PM, the particulate matter, is an ever-pressing problem.
Yes, I'd be happy to. So starting with particulate matter, or particles, as we like to call them, when we talk about particles, is really an entire family of these particles, right? Even when you look at our existing national ambient air quality standards, they typically refer to particulate matter as a whole. But this is not a single entity. It's really a whole family of different particles, different sizes, different shapes, different makeup in terms of physics and chemistry. And what we did in this review, in this book, is a number of us came together to review the latest information, specifically as it pertains to a subgroup of particulate matter, and that is these ultrafine particles. And the reason that is important is twofold. One, we don't currently have the standards for these. So these are essentially particles that we know exist, but we don't have either policies or standards that actually tackle them explicitly. And the reason this is important is because we are finding that when you look at the adverse health effects that comes from exposure to particulate matter, it seems to be that the real culprits are these very small. These are so small that you can't even see them with the naked eye. So that was really the impetus behind the book. And it's basically a review of the latest evidence about an emerging issue that not only in the U.S. but around the world we are trying to get our hands around.
So where do these ultrafine particles come from? It's
combustion again. A lot of them are actually starting off not as particles but precursor gases, and they form in dynamic processes in the atmosphere. They have very short lives, so they could be present in great numbers in busy freeways and roadways. And as you get away from the freeway, they reduce in concentration. So it's a very tricky problem. But again, the common theme is to the extent that we continue to rely on combustion to power our engines and equipment, we're going to have these issues.
And what kind of impact are they having on our health?
Well, the problem with these very tiny particles, one, is that they can, as we call it, translocate very easily. And that is, you breathe them in, and the natural barriers that the body may have for the larger particles are not effective to controlling them. So, we've been finding some of these particles in the brain, so we find them clearly in the respiratory system. So it's a whole host of impacts that we're just beginning to get our hands around understanding. And then, of course, the key question is, what are we going to do about it?
Indeed. And we know about particulate matter. I think there's been a lot of study done. A lot of science on that. And I just want to understand, though, you're saying that particulate matter is breaking down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces.
That particulate matter includes these very small subparticles, even though we don't explicitly call them out.
Okay. But we're realizing the danger of it because they are so tiny. And
Indeed.
And because of that, it's hard for us to get a handle on where they are and all that they're doing.
And our knowledge on these particles is just simply the evolution of science and technology. As we've learned more about how air pollution impacts the human body, we become better at characterizing these emissions. All of them come out of the tailpipe of an engine and a car. And how that exposure to these particles is really impacting our health. And that is why we have this particular book and an entire subject of epidemiology that is trying to understand the connection between all of us getting exposed to pollution, and specifically some of these particles, and then what happens to our response.
In other words, we're learning more about it, and it's all part of that black smoke that comes out of the tailpipe in front of you and beside you and around you. I'm glad that we now have the science, though, to understand it more. We all know many other things that are driving us to realize that now is the time when we must do something about the carbon emission because of its effect on climate change. We're going to go to break, and we'll be right back on the other side of the break to continue this very interesting conversation. Thank you. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on air quality and transportation, why our transportation impacts climate change so much. And we are back with Kelly Blynn with the Colorado Energy Office and Dr. Alberto Ayala from Sacramento with that Metropolitan Air Quality Management District. And again, thank you all for joining us today. I want to go back to Kelly now. And Kelly, I want to talk to you about, I guess, geography. Is there a part of the world and perhaps a part of our country that's at stage critical in terms of transportation pollution? And then talk to us more about the effect of geography on the impact of transportation on climate change.
Sure, would be happy to. I can probably speak best to some of the issues in our country. I know other parts of the world probably have some different air pollution and different transportation systems that probably mean their issues are a little bit different. But I think here in the U.S., we tend to face a lot of similar challenges. There are some differences from state to state. In general, like I mentioned before, we're seeing the bulk of our emissions from the cars that we drive, the trucks that haul our goods. And so, one of the things that contributes to that is sort of geography related is how our communities are built. Many American cities may have a really sort of compact downtown where you can get around by walking and public transit and that sort of thing, but generally have a lot of more dispersed, sprawling development outside of that generally does mean most people have to drive for a lot of their daily needs, whether that's going to school or work or whatever else they need, which really, drives up our emissions. So that's sort of one geography-related thing that varies within our regions, but is something pretty common to most American communities. One thing I would also say, and I imagine Alberto would have more to say on this, is, geography does have an impact on the levels of air pollution that we experience. All of our communities, there's a lot of driving happening and a lot of air pollution from that driving, but it does, because of, sunlight and altitude, the presence of mountains, et cetera, there are some different variables that mean right here in Denver, Colorado, we have a really big ozone problem because of our high altitude and our sunlight, and sort of mixed also with our mountains that trap some of that pollution, particularly in the summertime. So there are some different geographic variabilities in terms of the actual localized effects. That's
interesting because I don't think I would have thought that you all have those issues in Denver, but I'm glad you took the time to explain it because the geography does make a difference. Let me ask you how a place like the New York metro area would compare to like Dallas, because that's probably one of the tightest transportation systems where they just they physically can't get that many cars there as compared to us here in Dallas. So how would that compare in terms of transportation pollution?
Yeah, so I think if you looked at that on a per person basis, the New York City area almost certainly has the lowest emissions impact from transportation in the country because of that sort of compactness that they have. And most people, do walk and bike and take transit to get around that live in New York. And so that means on a per person basis, they're emitting less. So certainly that concentration of people moving and goods moving and, cars are still, if you spent time in New York, there's often that crush of taxis and trucks hauling goods around. So that, there's still a lot of emissions taking place there that you may be exposed to, which is why it's also important to think about how do we change out the fuels and the technologies that we're using in our vehicles so that even those places that may have lower emissions per person, don't have that high level of effect because of the cars and trucks that are still moving around.
Indeed, because I have to think, too, they have lots of ships and planes coming in as well, perhaps more so than other places, to service that compact area. So it's interesting that the differences that geography can make. I want to go to Alberto now. And could you talk to us a little bit, Alberto, though, about how the climate change caused by our transportation further piles on or exacerbates the health impacts of our transportation?
Well, there's obviously a whole host of health impacts from our warming climate. I mean, we are experiencing that at the moment in many areas in the U.S. and around the world. I mean, the heat waves that are becoming more intense, more prolonged, and more frequent are just going to continue to increase if we don't really get this issue of carbon emissions in check. So there's a direct connection there. But in terms of the direct health impacts, I want to bring us back to the convergence of when you're talking about carbon emissions or what we call conventional air pollution emissions. The converging point is really, again, combustion, right? Out of that single tailpipe of a vehicle, if you're still running an internal combustion engine vehicle, you're going to get conventional pollution. So you're going to get particulate matter. You're going to get nitrogen oxides and organic compounds that in the atmosphere are going to form into ozone. And certainly ozone formation is driven by temperature. So the hotter the days get, the more ozone we're going to be creating. So that's the same tailpipe that is going to be the source of a lot of carbon emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, as well as some of the other greenhouse gases that are associated with combustion. So that's why it's so important to find sustainable solutions that can get to both problems at the same time. And as Kelly alluded to, we know what those solutions are. We got to electrify transportation. We got to electrify the built environment and make sure that we use renewable energy to run our new power sources. And I think when we can do that, there is a direct correlation between removing the source of exposure to these harmful pollutants that we are breathing in. And if we can do that, we will go a long way for improving the outcomes for public health.
Indeed. And I think the national or perhaps the global conversation on electrification is moving forward. But my question is, how can we reduce perhaps the impact of particulate matter other than or before or as we begin to achieve substantial electrification?
So the way that we've done that in the States and around the world is promoting technology forcing policies at the federal and the state level so that if we have to use combustion, that combustion be getting cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. That means you are able to move your car around, but you're producing less pollution to begin with. In addition to technology, we want to promote what we call clean fuels. And that is, even though they may still be fossil fuels, but they can be cleaner and cleaner fossil fuels.
And what are some of those?
For example, in the old days, a lot of equipment run on diesel fuel. And diesel is very efficient, but it's also a source of significant amount of particulate matter and nitrogen oxide emissions. So over time, over the last 2 to 3 decades, we've been able to push, and the industry has developed cleaner and cleaner diesel technology. The reason we use gasoline vehicles is because gasoline combustion is cleaner than diesel combustion. We have natural gas combustion because natural gas is cleaner than the other. So that's what I mean by technology forcing policies that are always driving us to cleaner technology and cleaner fuels. The ultimate solution is to zero out those emissions. And as Kelly alluded to, the ultimate solution is let's forget about combustion altogether. Let's just go to the electric powertrain, and we're gonna the electricity that is gonna feed those powertrains is going to be renewable energy coming from either solar or wind or some of the other sustainable energy sources.
Indeed, indeed. Many of our guests on our previous show this month and last month have been making it real clear, and I want to make it real clear to the listeners. If it combusts, it's polluting the air. whatever it is. And while you are talking, my mind gets very creative sometimes, and I'm thinking, if we jump forward many, many years, 100 years, can we imagine ourselves getting a ticket or a fine for producing any combustion? It's interesting. I can see us getting there in order to save ourselves, our health, and our planet. Makes a difference. We just have a minute to go before we go to break. And so, Kelly, I want to start back with you briefly, and we'll finish on the other side. Does the way we drive our cars and our trucks and our planes and our transport facilities, the way we use them, the way we drive them, does that have an impact on the environment and therefore climate change?
Yeah, it does to some degree. The speed at which you drive, people have probably noticed if you drive way too fast on the highway, you're going to burn through your fuel a lot quicker. And so, there is sort of an optimum speed for highway driving, and also ways that you can sort of optimize your driving when you're around town. What's sort of interesting is with electric vehicles, there's a technology called regenerative braking, which is essentially when you're slowing down, it's sending power back to your battery. And so you actually get very efficient mileage just driving around town with those vehicles.
Indeed. And we're going to go to break, and we'll continue this conversation on the other side, because I'm wondering if you can do that sort of thing with gas-fired vehicles. Thank you. We'll be right back on the other side of the break with Dr. Alberto Ayala and Kelly Blynn. Thank you all. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Market, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. Our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care. Practicing dentistry for over 38 years, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lynndentalcare.com. And our other sponsor is the Weston A. Price Foundation, where ancestral wisdom meets modern science on food, farming, and the healing arts. The Weston A. Price Foundation is a nutrition foundation teaching people about healthy foods of the past and how you can incorporate those into your life. The foundation educates people on why grass-based and other foods are better quality, and then helps them find those foods. With their 50% Pledge campaign, the foundation encourages people to purchase 50% of their foods from local farms and artisans. Check them out and find more about them at westonaprice.org. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on air quality and transportation, why our transportation impacts climate change so much. And we are back with Kelly Blynn, who is with the Transportation Climate Change, and she's a specialist at the Colorado Energy Office, and Dr. Alberto Ayala, who is Executive Director of the Sacramento Metropolitan Air Quality Management District. And again, thank you all so much for taking time to be with us today. I want to start out this segment back with Kelly. Kelly, how has COVID impacted our transportation and our transportation pollution issues? And what have been the takeaways, or how have things changed as a result?
It's a really good question. I think we're still learning, because I think we're still kind of adjusting to what our new normal is going to be. But certainly during the early days of COVID, many office workers switched to working from home, which temporarily significantly reduced traffic and improved air pollution in many metro areas. As vaccines have become more widespread and things have opened up, driving has largely rebounded nationally. Even though many people are still working from home, many people do end up compensating by taking more trips to other destinations. So that's sort of an interesting thing that we're still trying to wrap our heads around is, where are people needing to get to now? And can those trips be served by other modes? How can we be spurring the adoption of electric vehicles more quickly? But COVID certainly has changed our travel patterns from what they used to be.
Did we learn anything, though, that we could take and use for good or duplicate or anything?
I think one of the really exciting things is a lot of cities and communities around the country, because people weren't going into work and, driving to the same places, they figured out how to reuse their street space in creative ways. Sometimes they shut down certain streets to be places where kids could play and where neighbors could interact outside safely. They allowed more sidewalk cafes. They installed sort of temporary bike lanes and that sort of thing. Some of those pilots have unfortunately gone away. Some have remained permanent, but I think they were, really good examples in different places of how we might use our public space differently than just car travel, and oftentimes in ways that were really powerful for bringing community together when we needed to be able to do that outside to be safe.
Now, Kelly, today and for the last 4 to 6 weeks here in North Texas, we've been at triple digits. And I do mean triple digits, which is really even unusual for us here. And that same heat has been, I like to say, it's been stalking some other parts of the country, perhaps like yours. Can you connect, though, the dots for our listeners as to the intersection of this extreme heat weather and our transportation?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's part of the, impacts that we're seeing from climate change already. And, even as we're trying to transform our transportation systems to reduce our emissions, we're also seeing that climate change is also, impacting our transportation networks. I know our transit agency here in Denver, I think just last week had some of its light rails were bent because of the extreme heat, and they were having to send out engineers to repair those. We've had, Glenwood Canyon shut down for a couple of weeks last summer because of mudslides, another form of extreme weather that we're seeing from climate change. That's a major part of our interstate, which, then, of course, sent people having to drive further out of their way and produce more driving. So, there are some feedback loops that we're starting to see with the effects of climate change, even as we're trying to combat it by reducing our emissions.
It's a vicious circle. Transportation drives climate change, and climate change impacts the transportation system. I want to move to Alberto now. And we talk about it and we know it, Alberto, but how do we know really that it's our transportation that is one of the most, if not the biggest contributor to climate change?
That one is easy. I mean, a lot of people like Kelly and myself that work in this space, we spend a lot of time doing simple accounting. And what I mean by that is we spend a lot of time understanding the various sources of emissions. So we take a car and test it in the laboratory and measure very precisely how much pollution comes out of that. And then the accounting process occurs because then, as we talked at the top of the hour, we start counting how many cars and how many miles we all drive, and then you start generating what we call emission inventory. So I think the evidence is clear that we have a very good accounting, not only in the U.S., but around the world in terms of, how much energy we use for the different sectors, how polluting those sectors are, how much a car contributes to carbon emissions versus particulate matter, et cetera. So I think the evidence is clear, and those accounting practices are absolutely essential when you think of organizations like myself who are in the business of air quality management. That is, what are we going to do about this pollution that we have a good understanding about?
Thank you. And I think the direction, obviously, of our air quality management as it relates to transportation is electrification.
It is electrification, but also we like to think, and I like to talk about better mobility, not just better transportation. And I think we do have to imagine a future where we are not so reliant on the vehicle, as Kelly alluded to, right? I mean, if we can imagine how we design our communities and our cities so that we can still fulfill every single mobility desire we may have, but do it in a better way, right? We talk about active transportation. Can we hop on a bike? Can we hop on a scooter? Can we walk? If we have to go longer distances, can we use innovative future transit, one that actually, a transit system that actually meets our needs? And then eventually, if we do need to rely on the vehicle, which likely we will, can we turn that vehicle into a zero-emission solution as opposed to relying on combustion?
Now, Alberto, I've seen and heard the term just transition, often as it relates to our transition to clean energy, including electrification. Can you explain to us what this is and how it affects everyone?
Yes, I think the reference to just transition is the just reference really refers to justice. And in the environmental community, we are talking a lot about a concept called environmental justice. But I think this is really tied to some of the other social dynamics that we saw recently in our country, which, you have to talk about social justice, you have to talk about climate justice, environmental justice, economic justice, racial justice. So I think it's a short term for a whole host of concepts. And really what it means is, as we all transition to this cleaner future, to this, zero emission future, we have to make sure that everybody has a chance to make that transition. This cannot be only about people who can afford to buy a new Tesla car. It has to be everybody. And it has to come with not only the technologies and the cleaner fuels, but also reimagining the jobs of the future and the educational opportunities that our kids are going to have for the future. So I think the just transition is what we often hear President Biden talk about in terms of an all-of-government solution to the climate crisis, meaning, we need to make sure that we check all the boxes and no one is left behind.
Indeed, and that's very critical and important to all of us, as we've seen really with the COVID pandemic. For example, if half or 30 or 40% of the population is driving Teslas, and the other half or 60% is still driving gas guzzlers, we're going to be at the same place we are now.
Precisely.
Alberto, we just have a minute or two before we're going to need to close this out. Talk to us about how ordinary people in their everyday lives can help drive solutions to this. And then also, before you go, to talk a little bit about what we've learned from the Volkswagen cheating scandal, which is the subject of your upcoming book.
I'd be happy to do that. On the first one, I think what I would suggest your listeners is that we all start by looking at the environment around us and the things that we can control and change. Recognizing that, again, every trip that we take to the supermarket, every trip that we take to work, if we're going to continue to use combustion engines for that, we are going to be part of the problem. But we can be part of the solution by accepting the fact that there are more sustainable options. Probably one of the best things that we can do is by voting for the right solutions and by accepting the fact that we know what to do. So that would be the most important recommendation. And, the book that I'm working on is simply, I had the fortune of being at the leading edge of the government effort against the violations that Volkswagen was responsible for. And the book is really a testament for the role of government and good regulation. Because if we were not watching, who is going to be watching for the consumer, for the public health? That's really what this is about, is governments and government regulation do have a very clear role to protect public health and our environment from excess pollution.
Indeed. And thank you for that explanation and connecting those dots for us, too. And you brought up a point that is very important, and it's really the purpose of this show, and that's connecting environmental issues and health impacts. And transportation, air pollution, climate change, they are public health issues. So thank you so much. We really appreciate you, Alberto, taking time to be with us today. We have been with Dr. Alberto Ayala, who is Executive Director of the Sacramento Metropolitan Air Quality Management District, and with Kelly Blynn, who is Transportation Climate Change Specialist at the Colorado Energy Office. Thank you so much for making us smarter. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line. so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is the result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day like yourselves. And each of those tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up, one way or the other, to the change we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you for listening in today, and join us again next week for more on air quality and transportation. Thank you.